Growing up, my family's favorite place to go to for American Chinese food was called the Red Coral Restaurant. It closed around a decade ago, but I can still see it very clearly in my mind. It had red leather upholstery throughout, pink, coral walls, dragons, bamboo plants, a Buddha at the bar who was also a fountain, and of course, at every single seat, a Chinese zodiac placemat. My family likes to be regular, so for our family of 6, every time we went, the order was vegetable soup with tofu, sesame chicken, vegetarian lo mein, white rice, vegetable egg rolls, and occasionally, like I said, my family likes to be very, very regular, very, very rarely, only on special occasions, and just for my dad, 1 egg foo young. No, it was not kosher. And yes, like many Jewish families, we did have paper plates and plastic forks and knives for when we brought the leftovers home. And I think the most pressing question all of you are currently considering is, yes, it was open on both December 24th and December 25th. And for years and years, whenever we were either parking ourselves into that stuffed restaurant on that day or taking away from a line that literally went around the wall, we would run into our neighbors, our friends from synagogue, fellow congregants, other rabbis, and many, many more. It felt like all of Jewish Denver could be found at the Red Coral. Tonight, I really want to take a break from the world. I want to leave behind these last few months. I want to leave behind our loss and the war and the stress, and of all the things to talk about tonight, I just really want to talk about Americanized Chinese food. And specifically, I want to talk about why it became synonymous with the Jewish observance of Christmas. And is there really a Chinese restaurant association that has yet to figure out why they do so much business with our community at the end of December? And by the end, I may even share with you a shameful secret. The foremost expert in Jewish custom and Chinese food on Christmas in the world today has a very familiar name to everyone who is gathered here. It is none other than Rabbi Plaut. Not our own Rabbi Plaut, but rather Rabbi Dr. Joshua Eli Plaut of Metropolitan Synagogue in New York City. And in his book, Kosher Christmas, Rabbi Plaut confirms the logical conclusion that many who have pondered this question quickly come to, that yes, the marriage of Jewish custom and Chinese food on Christmas begins in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, nowhere else but the Lower East Side of Manhattan. There, the mix of European Jewish immigrants along the Chinese immigrant community made up the 2 largest non-Christian groups in the city. The Chinese American community did not at first, of course, follow or keep a Western calendar. And as a result, their businesses were open on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And the Jewish community were similarly not observing the Christmas holiday. And so they were already familiar with the Chinese neighbors and the Chinese restaurants that bordered their Lower East Side tenements. Now, you may be imagining a world of poor Jewish immigrants who ate gruel at home for every meal, but I promise you, they did in fact dine out. In fact, the foreword even coined a Yiddish phrase, oisasin, for going out to dine. That was considered the sort of fashionable thing to do when you had a little bit of extra money, or if you wanted to taste something that no Ashkenazic kitchen was ever going to produce. In 1899, eating in Chinese restaurants had become so common that the Jewish press printed a scathing editorial condemning the abandonment of kashrut, calling it an epidemic of Jews eating at non-kosher restaurants, and that it was a failure of the current generation's morality. By the late 1930s, you were just as likely to find a Chinese restaurant as a deli in the quote-unquote Jewish part of town. And in the post-war era, Chinese restaurants became a major location for Jewish Sunday lunch. as Jewish suburbanites and city dwellers alike became more assimilated. And yet, despite that socialization and assimilation, they began to realize that things like Sunday church lunch was just never going to be available to them, and so off they went to the Chinese restaurant. Even after leaving the tenements of the Lower East Side, Jews keep eating Chinese food, and why not? Chinese food is, and was, relatively cheap, easy to find, and quite often delicious. Finally, as sociologist Gail Tuchman points out, the social positioning of the immigrant, both Chinese and Jew, allowed for a feeling of safety and a feeling of welcoming, a feeling that wasn't always present at quote-unquote white restaurants who looked down on or might refuse to serve Jewish customers. Christmas, Chinese food, and the Jews. Ultimately, an inevitable pairing waiting to happen. The availability of open restaurants and happy customers on the one day a year when no one else was eating out is, as one might say, beschert. The first recorded interaction of Jews and Chinese food and Christmas, according to Rabbi Plaut, occurred in 1935, when the New York Times reported that restaurateur Eng Si-chuk had delivered a chow mein to the Jewish Children's Home of New Jersey on Christmas Eve. And this is an interesting little side point that Rabbi Plaut makes. There's another reason why Jews and Christmas and Chinese food go together so well, which is the feeling of outsidership that many Jews experience during these days. And one possible tonic is the friendly interior of a restaurant where, surprise, surprise, you are surrounded by your own community, observing its own ritual. Plaut writes that, quote, Chinese restaurants on Christmas have really become this sort of temporary community where Jews in the United States can gather to be with friends and family. It is a secular way to celebrate Christmas, and it's also a time to shut out Christmas and announce your Jewish identity in a safe environment. There is, of course, another reason why Chinese food specifically became the takeout of choice for the Jewish community that was willing to stray in the lines. The laws of kashrut, when you simplify them as simple as they can possibly get and get it down to the barest semblance of something called kosher style, are essentially just two rules. Don't mix milk and meat, and don't eat forbidden animals. Chinese cuisine, unlike the other major immigrant food of the New York City of this era, which would be Italian, rarely, if ever, utilizes dairy at all. And pork and shellfish are usually wrapped up in wontons and dumplings, chopped and minced into small pieces, unrecognizable and quote-unquote out of mind. You compare this to the practices of Italian cooking, where milk and meat are liberally mixed, large pieces of pig are served in varieties of clear styles and flavors, and Tuchman, our sociologist, calls this practice of Jews feeling comfortable with Chinese food despite its inclusion of non-kosher ingredients, safe trafe. I heard it. Of course, as is so often the practice that we pioneer as the brave Jewish people, it's no longer just Jews eating Chinese food on Christmas. Chinese restaurants across the continent report that the highest sales they see and the busiest hours are often, for some reason, right at the end of December. And it always seems to happen for clients of now all religious and ethnic backgrounds. Which brings me to that lovely urban legend / social media post that I referenced earlier. I'm sure you've seen it. If not, you will see it sometime this week when you go online. It is a heartwarming image, a handwritten sign in the window or the door of a Chinese restaurant that says, "The Chinese Restaurant Association of the United States would like to extend our thanks to the Jewish people. We do not completely understand your dietary customs, but we are proud and grateful that your God insists you eat our food on Christmas." Now, while that is delightful, it is also a little silly to assume that after more than 100 years living side by side in North America, the Chinese and Canadian and Chinese American communities have not figured out what is going on with the Jews. And in fact, we know that as early as 1936, the Forward was hosting trilingual advertisements in Yiddish and English and Chinese from enterprising restaurant owners wishing the Jewish people a Happy New Year. And if you're wondering which New Year it was posted for, the historical advertisement, which was brought by Rabbi Plaut, was posted both in early September and in February, which is when the Lunar New Year is. I'm sorry to say, then, with that lovely little post, that next you see it, you're just going to have to remember that it's not real, and it was just created to make you smile. And yet, the idea that Jews celebrate Christmas by eating Chinese food remains factually and historically then rooted in truth. And not just in New York City, but now the cultural norm of this has spread throughout the entire Jewish world, including to the land of Israel. The 2 Chinese restaurants that were near my apartment in Jerusalem would always pull in a big expatriate crowd on December 25th, and I can tell you from personal experience that when I was studying in Israel, it was so important to me to keep this tradition alive that I invited over 20+ rabbinical students to come to my house one random Wednesday night for a Chinese potluck so that we could properly and truly engage in the minhag hamakom, in the custom of the place, the custom of our people. So let me conclude then by sharing 2 final thoughts with you all. The first is that shameful secret, which you may have already kind of guessed at, which is that I do not actually particularly like Chinese food, which is really to say I don't like the hyper-processed, Americanized Chinese food of my youth. And yet, like so many foods that are not for every day, but are tied to time and tradition, I actually still find myself craving red coral at this time of year, which, upon interrogation, I realize is not really a craving for food. It's a craving for nostalgia, and a craving for community, and a craving for peace of mind. Which brings me to my second thought, which is that perhaps what we really want this time of year, a time of year that so many people categorize by saying it is nothing but materialism, and what so many people say has become purely a secular moment in time, a secular time of year, is actually that we want something quite religious. Perhaps what we want is returning to that feeling that we had when we were children. That feeling of being loved, that feeling of being safe and secure, of returning to a moment when generations gathered and shared stories and memories and traditions. And perhaps most of all, we want that dream that's been sold to us, that all together, looking out into a cold, dark world that is yet bathed in the light of all of our different religious traditions, we might yet believe, unlikely as it seems, that we will all make it through together. And if we can't have that dream, I'll settle for an egg roll. Shabbat shalom.